This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and joining me today is a very special guest, Darren Mooney. Hi, Darren.
Hi, Duncan. How are things?
I'm good. We are actually recording at Darren's place in Dublin because I'm over here for the holidays. So thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting Primitive Culture.
The Primitive Culture World Tour begins now.
It does, yeah. Well, I always like to kind of get out of the house and do this show in random locations. So it's nice to be able to say we're doing one in a different country now. So
I do. I like the idea that you could sort of build up to doing it while doing certain activity. I think Primitive Culture while bungee jumping would be an interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, I was thinking Primitive Culture on the bus. We could definitely do one of them, or on a boat. That's what Clara and I were talking about last time. Maybe
that's
take a little cruise.
You could talk about like water in Star Trek and Star Trek's relationship, the metaphor, the nautical metaphor at the heart of it.
Definitely,
I think you could do Nicholas Meyer's movies while on a battleship would be the perfect sort of synthesis there.
It would be ideal, yeah. Or even, I suppose, really what we should be aiming for is in space. Primitive Culture in space. That's something to
it's good to have it. That's your 100th episode. That's the special day. Not to set the goals too high.
So, Darren, I mainly know you from X-Files podcast, from Tony's X-Files podcast, but I think you've guested on Trek FM before, haven't you?
I have indeed. I did an episode of Standard Orbit with Zach, talking about the third season of the original Star Trek, and how it is secretly the most influential piece of Star Trek ever produced. It's not the most influential, but it's secretly more influential than I think people give it credit for. So it creates a lot of concepts that we take for granted, like Kirk the Lady Killer, honorable Klingons, that sort of stuff. So it was kind of, I was rewatching it recently and it was kind of interesting to sort of dive into that a bit.
It's one of those kind of areas that I suppose, it has a bit of a reputation. Maybe people often skip a lot of those episodes. A bit like early Next Generation, I suppose. People say, don't bother with the first two seasons. And then actually if you do that, you miss out on a lot of good stuff one way or another.
Yeah, and you also, I think, miss out on the evolution of the thing as well, because it's always fun to watch from beginning to end. And I think, you being a historian and this being a history podcast, it's great to get a sort of a holistic view of how something evolves as it goes, as something sort of changes. And if you jump in on the third season where Piller takes over the Next Generation, and that arguably sort of sets the tone for the rest of the Berman era, you do miss like the awkward first 2 years where they're building it. You can see the blocks sort of coming together, but not quite. You also miss out on a lot of racism and sexism. But I mean, you got to take the rough with the smooth.
Yeah. And you miss The Measure of a Man, which is, the classic. And some other pretty decent episodes in there as well.
Yeah.
That, are definitely well worth going into. But anyway, we're not here to talk about the first few seasons of Next Generation. We're actually here to talk about Voyager today. But we are talking about history. We're talking about, I suppose, the extent to which it kind of struck me rewatching some episodes this week that of all the Star Trek series, I think Voyager is the one that seems to be the most interested in history and the most interested in not just in the past, but in our relationship to the past, in historiography, in nostalgia, in ancestry, all these kind of topics that sort of circle around this idea of, the relationship between then and now. Somehow, for some reason, Voyager coming at that point, kind of mid-90s, seems to really tap into that.
It really does. Well, I mean, I'm rewatching Voyager as well. I'm covering it on my blog as well to give that a shameless plug. Again, when I was watching it, I was struck primarily with how 90s it was. And one of the things about the 90s as a decade is that while we were living through the 90s, I came of age in the 90s. My memory of the 90s is this sort of hazy, muddy period where there was nothing specific about it whatsoever. And it was like, okay, well, everybody else got to live through, the Cold War or the Second World War. They got to live through these big historical moments, and the 90s had none of that. And it's kind of weird now when you have 90s nostalgia, when you have stuff like, say, Jurassic World, you have stuff like Independence Day Resurgence, even the X-Files revival, to get back to talking about the X-Files. You have this sort of fascination with 90s pop culture at the moment that sort of like tries to put a finger on what the 90s were and what they felt like. And when I was watching Voyager, I had this huge rush of blood to the head going, yes, this is exactly what the 90s felt like. Because it had that sort of moment where you have, like in Fight Club, which came in, I think, 2099, 2000?
Right.
Where Tyler Durden said, that monologue where it's like we are the middle children of history. We have no great war, no great struggle. Our great depression is our lives. That sort of existential crisis. And you can see that, I think, when you watch Voyager. And you're right to point out that, like, Voyager has this recurring fascination with history, with our relationship to it, and with how we remember it. And it has this sort of, it reminds me a lot of the debates that you had during the 90s, like, because obviously I think Philip Wegner, the historian, described the 90s in probably the best way that I've heard it described, which is life between two deaths, where you had on one end the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and on the other hand the attack on the World Trade Center. And like the collapse of the Berlin Wall meant that was the end of the Cold War, and I think the end of history in inverted commas, although now we might scoff at it. And then you had the attack on the World Trade Center, which led to the creation of the War on Terror. So you had these two big ideologically defined eras. And then in the 90s, you just had this sort of lacuna. It was Wells or somebody who said that, like, after the 9/11 attacks, history came back from vacation, which is a really great line.
Yeah.
But, like, in the middle of this, you just have this big period where we're wondering what it all means. And you're right to sort of single out Voyager's sort of interest in history. So, I mean, episodes like, for example, to be honest, the third episode of the first season is Now and Again, which is a time travel episode, and which establishes the idea of the reset button. But I mean, even then you have episodes like, for example, 1159, in which Janeway, delves into the history of her ancestors. You have episode like Living Witness, where the Doctor is taken into the future so he can provide an objective account of history as it occurred. You have episodes like Remember, which is explicitly a Holocaust denial episode. You have episodes like Distant Origin, which is about like digging into a national myth and sort of disputing whether or not that relates to like what really happened. So you have this sort of thing that runs through Voyager, this engagement with history, and that's before you get into the time travel episodes of the Brannon Braga era, which begin in the third season. So every episodes everybody knows, like for example Future's End, sort of Timeless, that sort of stuff, or even Endgame at the very end. Like Voyager was very entangled with this idea of history and what we remember of history and how we engage with history.
Definitely. And I wonder whether partly, maybe that's partly to do with the time that it was being produced, that it was this, as you said, this kind of time, sort of liminal time in a way between historical eras in a sense. Equally, I wondered if it might be that somehow, even when it started, Voyager already felt like kind of late Star Trek, because there'd been all that stuff before it, and then going into, they had their 30th anniversary quite early on, wasn't it? Like the second or third season, I think.
End of the second season, starting the third season with Flashback, the Sulu episode, which was filmed at the end of the second season, broadcast the second episode of the third season. Yeah.
And then, I just sort of wonder whether that kind of plays into it, because you get various things in Voyager. You get an interest in, allegorical representations of real world history. You talk about Holocaust denial or so on, and there are lots of other World War II related stories in there. Something, again, it has in common with the X-Files, I think, this idea of kind of guilt and
legacy,
the legacy of the Second World War. Yeah. Exactly. But you also get, both these episodes which seem to be about kind of the trickiness of history or the untrustworthiness of history, Living Witness being probably the best example of that. But you also get this kind of interest in the show's own history. So you keep getting these episodes where they go back, Relativity or Shattered, and they go back into the show's own kind of early seasons. And again, I think one of the things that maybe we could talk about is the relationship between history and nostalgia, because I think that's a kind of interesting sort of seesaw in some ways. And with Voyager, it's always kind of, I think both of those things are quite important to the show in a way. And it certainly is a show that has a lot of nostalgia for Star Trek's history, but also for its own history. And I think particularly as you go forward, I mean, my take on it is kind of that once you get to the fourth season, you get to the introduction of 7 and 9, you get this show that is kind of going in quite a different direction from where it started. It starts off Voyager in this quite kind of pure place somehow, and if you think of the relationship between Captain Janeway as a character and 7 of 9 as a character, Captain Janeway is very much not sexualized. She's very much this kind of sort of idealized 90s feminist vision in some
Hillary
ways.
Clinton in space.
Exactly,
almost.
Hillary Clinton in space, yeah. 7 of 9 is quite a regressive image in a
well,
sense.
sort of
It's kind of
60s,
buxom, but exactly, yeah. That's the kind of Brannon Braga
influence.
Brannon Bragaization of Star Trek in a sense. In a nutshell, it is right there. I do wonder if some of that kind of nostalgia that Voyager has for the show itself is to do with that sense that this is a show that has changed quite radically as it moves forward, and that there's something about that innocence of those early seasons that they, in a way, always trying to get back to somehow.
Interestingly enough, I would argue that it goes even further back than that. Like, and you're right to point out that, and this is something that isn't like discussed nearly often enough, is like Voyager is obsessed with the Second World War. So you have, for example, the first season you have Jetrel, which is a nuclear bomb story. You have, like, in the 4th season you have the Omega Directive, which is, like, we just discovered atomic power and stuff like that. You have all these sort of themes and ideas that bubble back. You have this weirdly weird sort of fascination with the communist scare that runs through episodes like Cathexis, early in the first season, where Tuvok is basically, it's a communist infiltration story. It's Invasion of the Body Snatchers on Voyager. In the Flesh, where they discover, like, you know, that Cold War fear that the Russians had, like, Potemkin villages of Americans, like, that they were trained to spy, which is basically that in space. But I think that even if you go back to the first season of Voyager, there's already a nostalgia there for what I think Star Trek used to be. And you hear a lot when you read interviews with, say, Piller and with Taylor, which is interesting because they were both, like, relatively new to Star Trek on The Next Generation. But they talk about, and you're right when it says maybe it's because the franchise was 30 years old, but they're talking about, like, Star Trek as this legacy and this back to basics sort of attitude. Like, so for example, Voyager takes a ship out of the Alpha Quadrant, which the Next Generation Deep Space Nine had built up as this big, like, empire sort of realm with continuity and history. So you have the Romulans, you have the Klingons, you have the Cardassians, you have this history that goes back decades, you have this sort of trapping of politics and all this sort of stuff, and basically dumps Voyager in what is the Delta Quadrant, which is what is revealed to be basically this little place with no history, with no sort of sense of continuity. It's got no empires in it. It's largely episodic. Like, if you look at Caretaker is quite consciously an attempt to get back to Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars. The point where the Kazon and like, there's a separate podcast in talking about the Kazon. But the Kazon are many things, but part of what they are is an attempt to create, like, this old school sort of 1950s Native American sort of, like, Red Indian sort of threat to the European settlers. They're they're the guys with bows and arrows, or with stones in their hairs, who represent sort of a primitive threat to this encroaching civilization as represented by Voyager and its technology and stuff. And I mean, even if you go beyond that, you look at stuff like the Vidians, and you have this idea of the Delta Quadrant as a place that is less advanced technologically and in terms of civilization than the Alpha Quadrant. So you have this idea of, like, getting back to the Adventure of the Week format. I mean, you would even argue in Caretaker, Chakotay, who again is a separate podcast unto himself, but he's presented as this sort of, like, stereotypical Native American guide character. He's presented the same way as Toto is in not Toto, the Lone Ranger.
Right,
that sort of, like, that supporting Native American character, who's there to enable and sort of offer spiritual advice, and even to do, like, he treats his spiritual beliefs, if you look at episodes like The Cloud, like sort of performance art for the rest of the crew. It's like, you know, I'll take you on this sort of spirit guide journey. Never mind the fact that I've spent my entire life preparing for this, and it's a hugely important spiritual deal for me culturally. You just want to dabble in it for an episode or two. Let's do that. Let's go with that. I've known you for 6 months. We'll get into that. It'll be fine. But, like, I think that when you look at early Voyager, there's an attempt to get back to, like, what Star Trek was in the middle of the 20th century. Like, what science fiction was in the middle of the 20th century. So, like, stuff like Finding the 37s, where you have, like, the floating, like, Americana, the truck floating in the wilderness. You have this sort of, like, people who've been abducted and taken to a planet far away where they start a new sort of civilization. So I think that that nostalgia that you talk about there was very much already built into Voyager from the start. I do think you're right, though, when you say in the 4th season it becomes a lot more reflexive, where you have episodes like the Voyager Conspiracy, where 7 of 9 basically looks through with it like the lens of a continuity obsessed fan, and tries to retroactively, like, tether together all these events. You have Relativity, where 7 of 9 goes back to before the launch in Caretaker and into the middle of, I think, Alliances in the 2nd season. You have, for example, Fury, where Kes shows up and she's mega irritated, and she goes back in time and tries to sell Voyager to the Vidians. You have Shattered, where the entire history of Voyager is sort of laid out as a smorgasbord for Chakotay to explore and sort of wander through. You do have that, I think, and you're right that it begins with Braga. You have this idea of, like, Voyager's own history being fragmented and scattered and sort of like something to be explored and picked through, which is really weird because unlike, say, Deep Space Nine, where you did have this weight of history moving through it, where you had like characters who had like arcs and development. Like Bashir is fundamentally a different person and emissary than he is in What You Leave Behind. With Voyager, many of the characters stayed in place. Like I can't tell you a difference between Chakotay in Caretaker and Chakotay in Endgame.
Yeah.
But for some reason, Voyager has this interesting, this fascination with like smashing up Chakotay's timeline and going, well, let's meet Chakotay from the 3rd season. Let's meet Chakotay from the 1st season. They're the same character. Like I can meet Chakotay from the 1st season right now. All you need to do is just go to the bridge.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, it's interesting though that you mentioned the Voyager conspiracy and that idea of the kind of obsessive fan. I was just thinking about Enterprise. I know with Enterprise, Brandon Braga had this real issue with what he called continuity pornographers.
Yeah.
And his view was that the fans were so kind of, and I guess this was sort of early days of the internet, and they were getting more feedback and they were getting more criticism. And he sort of felt like this obsession with continuity was kind of strangling Star Trek in a way. So it's strange that at the same time he has this kind of desire to go back and desire to kind of rehash things. I don't know if maybe it comes out of All Good Things being so successful, and that's kind of maybe almost the starting point of that idea of, okay, so let's look at Next Gen, let's look at where it came from, let's look at where we are now, and kind of put those things against each other. But definitely towards the later seasons of Voyager, you're getting that again and again and again, this kind of obsession.
Well, it's fantastic that you mentioned like Braga as like a bashing of continuity pornographers, and like there's this really weird thing that like Braga famously said that like one of his conversations with Gene Roddenberry while Gene Roddenberry was alive was Braga had not watched the original series, and Roddenberry said, don't watch the original series, I want you to come at this fresh. It's kind of fascinating then that you get Braga as the man who's like, let's go back and do a Star Trek prequel, even though I had not watched any of the original series up until about 3 years ago. And you have this sort of, even within Voyager, like I would argue like the Enterprise is a logical sort of follow on from Voyager, because Voyager is so nostalgic. And like Voyager, like you want to talk about Voyager nostalgia, the entire purpose of Voyager as nostalgia is it's a ship going home. Like if you look at, say, the original Star Trek, that was the Enterprise going out into space, new worlds and new civilizations, charting the frontier. You look at, say, even the Next Generation, like not as heavy in the Pillar era, but at the very start it was like at the very limits. Farpoint Station was the edge of known space, and you were pushing out further than that. And I mean, even in the later seasons, you had like first contact with alien species, and you had sort of like establishing diplomatic relations, sort of deepening maybe rather than broadening the Federation. You have, even in Deep Space Nine, like it takes place in a wormhole that's like a gateway to the Gamma Quadrant, that like you keep sending ships through even after the Dominion's like, dude, stop sending ships into our space, we're getting a little miffed. Like you have, throughout the first 3 series of Star Trek, you have this push outwards, and it's sort of like American Manifest Destiny, sort of like the universe will be, like will not conquered, because this is a very utopian and peaceful idea, but it will be explored, and it will be sort of like, we will touch every part of the universe, and that's fantastic. We'll make these connections, like you will have like the human spirit in space. And
we get that even in Discovery as well, with the first episode of Discovery is on the edges of Federation space again, so they're kind of, and beyond, again, they're kind of returning to the idea of the edges of Federation space, the edges of mapped space.
But Voyager, on the other hand, like the premise of Voyager is you have a ship from Earth that gets sent out into the far reach of the Delta Quadrant, places where they've not gone before. And what's the first thing they do? Turn around and start heading home.
Go straight home,
Go straight home. And it is. And so much of Voyager is like, okay, have we found a shortcut home yet?
Yeah.
Can we take a shortcut home? As opposed to like dwelling in the wonder of exploration. And it's understandable given the premise of the show. But I think the premise of the show is very revealing in that sense, in that it's like an attempt to get back.
Get back to something.
To something.
And I suppose the question is, is that ever possible? Because, they found with Enterprise, they tried to get back to this kind of old-fashioned Star Trek. Maybe it didn't quite work. It didn't quite land somehow. I mean, and the big question is, can you ever go home again? I mean, Voyager's whole mission is trying to get back home. Then by the time we get to the last episode, what's the toast? It's to the journey, because they realise that somehow, it's not to say they don't want to get home, but that getting home is not quite what... That they found their own home. Someone like Tom Paris has found a home on Voyager that he never had on Earth. Yeah. And in some ways, you kind of think, people are always saying, I want to know what happens next. And I know the novels go into this and so on. But in some ways, I sort of feel it must be quite sad for them what happens next, because they have built up such a family, they've built up such a home on this ship, and they're inevitably going to be dispersed, and that's going to be lost, and Earth is not going to be quite what they remembered. And I think maybe that you could see that as one reason why in Voyager you go from the early seasons where there is this real nostalgia for Earth. I mean, I'm thinking of, say, in Death Wish, you have Janeway kind of looking out at Earth,
at the window,
that kind of Earthrise image almost, with Kate Mulgrew's sort of Catherine Hepburn eyes kind of gazing at it. And you get even something like Eye of the Needle, their first season episode. I feel like there's that real kind of yearning for home. And it's interesting, talking about nostalgia. The word nostalgia is actually from the words nostos and algia. Algia is like pain, like, neuralgia. Nostos is to do with homecoming. So it's the idea, and it was coined to describe Swiss mercenaries, I think, who were far away from home, yearning to go home. So that idea of nostalgia is very much describing people in the same situation as the Voyager crew. They're far away from home, they're wanting to get home. It's that kind of homesick longing. But maybe that's one reason that we see this kind of transition from, in the early seasons, this nostalgia for this kind of idealised Earth that may or may not really exist anymore, to in the later seasons, the nostalgia is for the journey itself. So the nostalgia is to go back to, see season 3 when Kes was still around, or to go back to, earlier stages in the show's history.
I wonder if this is down to the ratings and the stuff, because I think you could argue that the decline in Star Trek ratings arguably began with the end of The Next Generation. It peaked, it rose throughout the run of The Next Generation, and then it sort of gradually collapsed. And obviously there were Deep Space Nine happening in the middle, and there was a clear decline in ratings over the airing of Deep Space Nine. But Voyager was the first show that inherited that. So Voyager, a downward trajectory from the moment that it began in terms of ratings. And I wonder if some of the nostalgia is based around that. In that it's okay, well, at the start we wanted to get back to what Star Trek was in the 60s with Indians and Native Americans and this sort of primitive, get back to the frontier and this sort of stuff. And then it basically became, okay, well, actually looking at the ratings now, we kind of want to go back to where we were 7 years ago. And you're right when you say, and it's funny that you should point that out when you say Enterprise going back as well. Every iteration of Star Trek following Voyager has been a step backwards nostalgically. Yeah. So obviously Enterprise went back to the founding of the Federation, stuff like that. The J.J. Abrams movies went back to the Kirk era and just flat out rebooted them with new actors.
And they're even technically prequels because they're they're set a few years before the original Kirk era. Yeah. There's that kind of weird time shift. So yeah, everything basically has been a prequel since Voyager.
Which is so you have literally gone back. You've accomplished what Voyager wanted to do in a sense, in a very literal sense.
Yeah.
And I feel keep in mind that I love the Abrams movies. I quite like Discovery. I really like the final 2 seasons of Enterprise. But I do feel like you've lost something of the push forward in Star Trek. And I think Voyager in many ways sort of marks the turning point of that. I mentioned the end of history earlier, and we talked about the decline of ratings over Voyager's run. If you look at Voyager, one of the more interesting aspects of it is that it establishes, and this is Braga, this is all Braga, it establishes a stable and linear future for the Star Trek universe. It's the point at which you introduce the 29th century into Star Trek continuity. So you start getting this idea of a Star Trek time core, a Starfleet time core. For example, Braxton in Future's End and Braxton again in Relativity. But you have this idea that and then this ties into the idea of the end of history, in the 90s, which is...
And the temporal Cold War and an Enterprise, which is sort of the same thing, but sort of twisting it, I suppose, on its head.
It is. That's what I would argue is a key shift. Because in the 90s, we believed that, the end of history, liberal democracy represented the end of all things, and there was nothing more to do. And, there were no war worlds to conquer. So, Voyager works on the assumption that Star Trek will always be here. You can extrapolate Star Trek into the 29th century and it will still fundamentally be Star Trek. They'll still be wearing those silly little insignia badges. Maybe the uniforms will be a bit different, but it'll be the same basic logic. And then, when you reach, 9/11 in Enterprise, which coincided with the first season of Enterprise, you have this sort of, oh my God, what if the future's not set? What if the future that we took for granted, we assumed was going to be there, peace, prosperity, the triumph of liberal democracy, the Federation enduring forever? What if that doesn't actually exist? And, that's where you get the Cold War, where you have stuff like Daniels and you've got the Xindi arc, and you've got oh my God, what if none of this actually comes to pass, despite the fact this is technically a prequel, and you would assume that it is entirely impossible for it not to come to pass. It's the future is suddenly thrown into doubt, which is kind of interesting after the nostalgia of the 90s.
It's interesting though as well. One of the episodes that maybe we could look at in a bit of detail is Living Witness, and Living Witness I think is the furthest point in the kind of Star Trek chronology. I used to have one of those, the Star Trek chronology, but I think that was probably an edition before that episode came out. But I'm pretty sure that's kind of the furthest point in the future that the franchise ever goes. That the franchise ever gets to. And there is something, and that was a Brannon Braga. Certainly, he wrote the story. I think he came up with the story for that one.
And Brian Fuller,
exactly,
which is a powerhouse.
It is absolutely a sort of dream team of And in some ways, it's quite a kind of. It's almost quite a sort of hard science fiction concept for Star Trek. Do you know what I mean? To sort of take you that far out of your comfort zone, to take you that far into the kind of cold old future somehow. And as they mention in that episode, all the crew have long since died. The Doctor makes this joke about Captain Janeway spinning in her grave. I mean, it's sort of so far forward that it's not even like when we jumped from the original series to Next Generation. It was just about possible, McCoy was still alive, and obviously and then Spock. Scotty turned up. Spock was still alive. It was within a lifetime.
A single generation.
It was exactly. Yeah, it was kind of someone could remember those times just about. Yeah, or even and later on, someone like Dax could literally have lived through those times many times over or whatever. Whereas if you jump 700 years in the future, that is. It's different somehow. And I suppose when we're thinking about nostalgia, when we're thinking about history and all these things, I guess that affects how we relate to certain periods of the past. So say the Second World War, which is what I largely write about, is just about within living memory. Because, I mean, my work is basically interviewing people who lived through it and then writing about their experiences. And I think it does definitely make a difference once you lose that kind of personal, individual connection in that way, that you can actually speak to people about it, which is why Living Witness, I suppose, is quite interesting, because it again ties into that idea of kind of oral history, that idea of they call him a living witness to history, and that idea that somehow that for Voyager seems to be the guarantee of historical truth. Oddly, that official history can be subverted, so we see that in Remember as well. Origin, for example. Yes, exactly. Well, I was thinking of the Voyager episode Remember, where B'Elanna Torres gets these memories about this kind of Holocaust that happened, basically. And the official story is that this never happened. It's being kind of
glossed over, pushed onto the road.
Exactly. It's like, I don't know if you know the novel Fatherland, Robert Harris novel, which is set in Germany in the 1960s, Germany having won the Second World War. And it's all about, they're trying to kill, this is a big spoiler, by the way, for anyone who wants to read that novel. The
pause the podcast.
Yeah, pause the podcast.
Go off, read Fatherland, and then come back and
because
join us.
It is kind of a crime mystery. But anyway, I'm going to tell you what the resolution is, because my point won't make sense. History did it, exactly. Basically, they are bumping off the surviving members, the surviving people who were at the Wannsee conference, where the final solution was agreed, because that is kind of the last step in pretending it never happened, in a sense. Yeah. And so it's very much that idea of what can you brush on, what can you sweep under the carpet of history? And in that Voyager episode, it's this one individual old lady sharing her memories. It is the kind of oral history again. It's someone saying, well, this is my personal experience. I remember it. I'm not making this up. And we see that, I suppose, with, the Holocaust, Holocaust survivors who go into schools and tell their individual stories and so on. And again, I'm trying to think, when was the whole David Irving thing? Would that have been around the same time?
Probably denial and stuff.
Exactly.
I think it was only decided in 1999, I think, but the case would have been going on.
It might have been going on during that period. So exactly that idea that, there's this kind of attempt to subvert the truth somehow. There's this attempt to kind of brush over what's happened, and the importance of kind of reclaiming that and reclaiming the integrity of what happened.
Well, I think that's important, because it's important to say that, like, Voyager, in terms of, and this is probably something that's true of the X-Files as well, is it arrived at the moment where stuff like the Second World War and the Holocaust were slipping from living memory. You had stuff like, say, Schindler's List, where Spielberg, as well as doing Schindler's List, he also organised a project as well to record statements from survivors and stuff like that. And the idea was that because it was slipping from history, and I think there was also, to be honest, I think there was a discomfort with the idea of, like, postmodernism in the 90s. So this idea that, like, history was not an objective truth. And I think you sort of saw that in the States, where you were arguing about stuff like the treatment of Native Americans and the discussion of slavery in classrooms. But in terms of European history, the Holocaust is the big one. But you have this idea that, like, as this stuff slips from memory, all of it's up for grabs. Like, you no longer have, like, good guys and bad guys in history. You can argue any which way. You can have, like, Irvin arguing, like, this horrific, like, fan fiction-y version of history, which has no relation to the facts. But he can build he could get a little string of text here, a little string of text there, just enough to grant it a veneer, like, so that you want to believe it. And, like, it's kind of
like a conspiracy theory.
It is.
It's the same kind of approach.
It's a narrative. Yeah, it's a narrative of history that supports a particular worldview, and it has no relation to facts. And I think, like, it's interesting. Like, we're recording this in, like, the end of 2017, going into 2018. Like, this is an era where facts. We live in a post-fact era.
Exactly. Alternative facts. It's
fake news, this sort of stuff. And I think you can see some of that in the 90s. You can see that some of that anxiety, I think, in shows like The X-Files, where, like, covering up the past is a huge deal. But a lot of stuff in The X-Files was, like, taken directly from, like, examples. So, like, the idea of Nazis being honoured by the US government for the work they did in the space program. That's not X-Files history. That's real history. It's just we just threw some black oil and colonization stuff on top of it. I think that when you look at Voyager has a lot of the same anxieties. It's like, well, if the people who lived through this stuff are passing away, like if we are so far removed from what actually happened that we're relying on secondhand accounts, well, who writes those secondhand accounts? And what political points are those secondhand accounts bolstering? And that's a big deal in Living Witness, where the idea is that you have this horrific sort of past that exists between these two cultures. But what they've chosen to do is they've chosen to agree amongst themselves to write a version of history that demonizes Voyager in order to justify their political beliefs. And like you have the Doctor rejecting that. And it's not just, you're right when you say it's not just something that comes up in, like Living Witness is the best example of it, but it's also a fundamental part of like Remember. It's a fundamental part of Distant Origin as well, where you have this idea of, you know, who writes history and what does it serve? And it also comes back and say, you know, 1159, which is the big millennial episode, in case you wanted more proof that Voyager was a 90s TV show. But
and again, they got it wrong. I mean, that's the thing, is it's not just the interest in history, it's the idea of getting history wrong, isn't it? And the importance of getting it right. And I suppose Memorial is another one, you know, this long-distant event that has to be recorded and re-experienced. And I suppose that's part of it. With the Second World War, I think there's this, because it's this lingering legacy of guilt and and this idea, Seven of Nine talks about it in one of those episodes. She talks about, you know, what the guilt of being a Borg does. And she says that it's sort of morally instructive, basically, that if you're aware of the things that have been done wrong in the past, I mean, this is a kind of a truism in a sense, you know, that we study history so we don't make the same mistakes or whatever. But that on some more personal level, it's important to feel the shame for the things that have happened, you know, to really kind of connect with that, to own that kind of shame in order to imbue yourself with that kind of moral
direction.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't work in a sense if it's too detached. You have to kind of experience, and again, it comes back to this idea of what is our connection to the past? Because again, I was thinking of, I mean, this is slightly different, but thinking about nostalgia, there's the episode One Small Step, which is about this kind of future nostalgia, because it's not nostalgia for us, because it hasn't happened yet. It's science fiction for us, but for them, it's nostalgic history. It's this kind of iconic moment in history. And Seven of Nine says in that episode, she sort of says, what's the point of this? You know, you're risking people's lives to go and collect this meaningless artifact. And Captain Janeway has this speech where she sort of says, you know, it's important for us to connect tangibly to our past, to make it mean something to us. And you see it in First Contact as well, where Picard is saying how he wants to touch it. He touches it exactly with his hand. And the importance of kind of reaching back, I suppose, through time and trying to connect with the past, which is very much what ancestry is about, you know, reaching back to your ancestors and trying to kind of learn about their real lives, trying to connect with them as if you know them somehow, as if they're more than just, you know, names on a family tree.
Empathy, it's the idea of like transcending the bounds of like person-to-person empathy and like extending beyond that and like trying to imagine what the past felt like. And I think you're right, actually, and it's kind of interesting when you mentioned One Small Step. I also thought of Friendship One, which is another Voyager episode that more tangentially touches on the past. We have this idea of a Federation probe that was sent out and seeing the legacy and the consequences of that as Voyager sort of journeys back. You have this sort of like journeying to the center of a tree, or like going through the various rings almost, which is an interesting sort of metaphor for the journey of Voyager. You have like this idea of like exploring the consequences of decisions that were made long ago.
I guess one interesting area here is that to many people, nostalgia and history are in opposition to each other. And for me, this is something that I'm quite aware of, because you describe me as a historian, I think. I have never described myself as a historian, though. I've often been described as such.
It's not for you to take the label. No, I know.
Well, that's sort of what it feels like, because I don't
never calling yourself a writer. It's like you have to wait for somebody else to call you a writer before you've earned it. It's like,
exactly.
Duncan, you're a historian. It's
exactly.
Okay.
Well, there you go. I mean, I write about history. I suppose I write about the past, so maybe I am a historian. I'm not a kind of professional. I'm not an academic historian. I suppose that's what I mean. And my approach to history...
The book that I'm familiar with you is literally titled Star Trek in History, isn't it?
No, it's called Star Trek: The Human Frontier. But anyway, my point, I suppose, is in my own work, because what I do is basically history through ordinary people's eyes. So it involves a lot of interviewing. It's very personal. And I believe in that. I think that's important, because I think if you only get the kind of kings and queens and you only get the kind of political history, you don't necessarily understand things how ordinary people experienced it. So if you look at something like the Second World War, I'm kind of interested in a person who was just trying to get by, put food on the table, not get blown up in the Blitz. You know, the kind of ordinary experience, in a sense. I think that's important. But it's interesting because the books that I write are on that sort of boundary between social history, which is sort of, reasonably respected, if not by really snobby historians, and nostalgia, which is not really a respected genre. It's seen as kind of more disposable. It's seen as a kind of almost a guilty pleasure somehow. If you buy a nostalgia book, it's because you want to sort of revel in this kind of fantasy of the past and so on. And there's also a question about marketing. What kind of cover do you slap on the book? Do you make it a hardback or a paperback and so on? How do you kind of negotiate those issues? So I'm quite aware in my own work, there's this like history on one hand, which is very serious and weighty and has a lot of footnotes and it might be a little bit boring and probably too long. There's nostalgia, which is seen as a bit soft and a bit kind of, and people will say, well, how do you know that someone tells you something, how do you know that that's true or whatever? And there are legitimate questions around truth if you're writing about things that aren't necessarily recorded in some factual, official way. At the same time, I think you can discover things because if you do the kind of research that I do, say you interview 50 people who lived through the same experience, and maybe if one of them tells you something that you've never heard about, have no record of or whatever, you maybe think that seems a bit odd. I'm not 100% sure about that. If 30 of them tell you the same thing, the likelihood is that there is actually some part of history that has not been, no one has bothered to write that down before, and that maybe, and it might be a small thing, but it is part of our collective experience and it's kind of worth recording. So for me, I have quite a lot of sympathy with this idea that Voyager presents, that the kind of authentic, individual, personal experience is what's valid. And I think it's interesting, even in quite a different episode, Author, which is a strange example because in Living Witness, the Doctor is the guarantee of history. He is the authentic voice of history against historical revisionism. And he has that line. He says, revisionist history, it's such a comfort, isn't it? In Author, he is the revisionist historian, basically fictionalising, but not really fictionalising, sort of telling a lot of elements of a true story and then revising them. Exactly, shifting the emphasis to suit his particular agenda. And the weird thing about that episode is what swings it in the end is that we see the crew give these kind of oral history testimonies about the Doctor, basically, and it becomes very much about the individual truthful personal experience. That's what kind of wins the case in a sense, is everyone tells their own little story about how I met the Doctor and how he helped me in this way and how he did this and blah blah blah. It's not, the logs, it's not the archives, it's not the kind of recorded material, it's not the historical material in inverted commas, it's the kind of personal testimony in a sense that is what is going to solve that case in a way.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's a lot of that in Voyager in terms of, Voyager is very interested in this idea of storytelling as well. And I suspect this is like Joe Menesky's sort of influence on Voyager, where you have stuff like, for example, even as early as False Prophets, like you have this idea of Voyager being a legend that sort of spreads across the Delta Quadrant. You have it later on in Muse, where B'Elanna sort of gets trapped. And you do have this sort of interesting contrast that sort of like winds through Voyager as a question of like, are these characters really people or are they stories? And are we actual objective people who exist, or are we narratives that are cultivated and stuff like that? Like you have entire episodes of Voyager where the crew don't actually appear, or where they appear in minimal roles. Like for example, Living Witness, where the Doctor is like only a copy of himself, and all the crew that appear are just like holographic representations. Of Course Oblivion, where they're just duplicates who have basically convinced themselves that they are the real Voyager crew and have to confront this reality that they're actually just sentient goo.
And then you have the reset button. I mean, famously, the reset button has the same effect because in a sense, obviously the people may have existed, but the whole story ceases to exist. And you don't have, you see, and I think it's quite important when we talk about the reset button, you have had things like, say in All Good Things, there's sort of a reset button, but if someone remembers it, then again, it's that idea of personal memory, personal experience. Picard can tell everyone what happened, and therefore it did happen in a sense, even if it doesn't happen. It's not gone forever. It's not lost forever. And I think there is something about that terror of, in Enterprise with the temporal Cold War, of things being lost forever and sort of obliviated. Yeah, exactly. Which is what you get in Year of Hell. That's what the kind of existential horror of Year of Hell is.
And Voyager has like several. It's like Relativity has the same sort of thing. Oh, don't worry, we'll wipe your memories before you dump you. Yeah. Except, do they wipe Janeway's memory? I can't remember. I think Janeway is told, but Janeway's told she can't tell anybody.
Right. Okay.
Anyway. Yeah. But there's a lot of that in Voyager. There's a lot of like wiping it or pretending it didn't happen. And there's a lot of like Course Oblivion's a great example of one where like, and it's got this really mean-spirited ending where it's like we have this record of recollections of the crew, our data, our personal logs, who we are. We put them in a capsule. We're going to launch into space and we'll survive in some way, shape or form. At the very end of the episode, they pick up something in the distance and it's actually Voyager by sheer coincidence. And they're like, okay, well, don't worry. We'll launch the thing and we'll communicate with them and that way we'll be known and we'll be shared. It's like, oh no, wait, the firing mechanism has jammed. We're going to explode now. Bye. And you cut to the bridge of Voyager and they're like, what was that? Oh, nothing, just a blip. And it's like that entire, like the entire lives of these people are lost because their stories weren't able to be told. And there's a whole host of those episodes sort of throughout Voyager's run as well, where you have that sense of like, and I mean, you could argue like even in terms of the reset button when it's not exactly a reset button. Because I mean, like Now and Again was the third episode of the show and it had a reset button. It's like the reset button is a fundamental part of what Voyager is. It's like this is an essential.
But Cass remembers something, doesn't she? In that
she has
episode,
a feeling,
right? Yeah,
if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think you might be right.
She comes to the bridge and like they're like, oh, we just detected an energy surge, and she's like, never mind.
Right. Yeah.
Doesn't matter whatsoever. Because Kes isn't even the viewpoint character in that episode. Janeway is. Janeway goes down to the planet and gets embroiled in their politics and like witnesses all these people dying, and it's like,
and then forgets about it.
Yeah, then forgets about it completely. Because you do have this sort of aspect of it. I wonder if that's maybe part of an attempt to get back to like the archetypal Star Trek, where you could watch an episode and have a sense that nothing had happened to the character since you last watched it, or whether it is sort of a commentary on how disconnected we are from history, or how listless we felt in the 90s. But like, because we felt like it was the end of history. It's the idea that history was no longer something that happened,
and therefore there is no future in a sense. So we have
the future is now.
We have these anxieties about the past, but the future is almost. Yeah, I mean that's another way of looking at it. So we talked a little bit about the way the show kind of envisages our relationship with the past, with nostalgia, with kind of engaging with history, with ancestry and so on. But this question of how we'll be viewed in the distant future is another element of it. And that's the situation the Doctor is in Living Witness. Is everyone is dead. It's long in the future, and he gets a glimpse of what is their legacy, what is their how are they being remembered. And of course, in that example, it's appallingly badly. But I mean, I think there is that kind of anxiety when we think about the distant future. There is something kind of cold and something kind of frightening about it. I mean, I'm thinking, say in Doctor Who, they had those episodes where they went to the end of time or something, and I feel a kind of existential dread of that idea, and that our sun's kind of gone cold, and everything has changed,
everything's ruined,
exactly, and
civilization
exactly the whole exactly Earth is who knows exactly
nobody remembers, nobody survives
we've done, all our achievements, all our best intentions, all amount to nothing ultimately in the end. There's that kind of anxiety, but there's also that idea of just how sort of strange it would be, because what we don't see in Living Witness is that kind of what you would expect, and you get elsewhere in Star Trek, of like the person who's woken up in the future and they can't adapt to life in the future because it's all techno crazy and different. Because actually that alien society doesn't seem technologically any more sophisticated.
700 years more advanced than we are.
Nothing much has happened. But I was thinking, because I'm in Ireland over the holiday. Yesterday I went to a lighthouse in Wexford where my aunt lives, and we went on this tour of the lighthouse. I went with my 2-year-old son and my partner, and they had these projections of different historical characters, and I was thinking it's eerily similar to the situation the Doctor was in, because literally we walked into this 14th century lighthouse and the guy pressed a button and this glass screen was hanging, suspended in midair, hanging by these sort of invisible wires. And suddenly the character of a 14th century monk appeared on this screen and began telling us the story of how he came to this lighthouse and set up the fire to help the ships and so on. And I was just thinking, and this monk was based on a real historical figure who's obviously, someone had written a script and an actor had got dressed up and performed and so on. But I was thinking, what would the original 14th century monk have made if he had turned up today and come on this tour and saw this version of himself giving this tour to this group of futuristic people? How would he how would he kind of process that? How would he engage with that? How would he feel about the fact that we were all touring his his lighthouse? It was a sort of lighthouse and talking monastery about it as a kind of a piece of ancient history, and also how many of the details about even things like the sort of characterization of these people, the performance that they're giving. There's so little information when you're talking about that length of time. Going back to kind of medieval history. So much of it is filling in the gaps, making guesses, the actor kind of putting on a certain kind of performance. How radically different would it have seemed to that person? Would it have been as bad? I mean, not as bad morally as the latent image thing, but in terms of just the kind of details of, what people looked like, how they talked, I mean, there are small details in that episode, like Janeway calling Chakotay Chakote. There's
or even the tattoo on
the tattoo being the wrong size.
Yeah,
exactly.
the leather jacket.
Or the Doctor being an android and not a hologram. These kind of things.
Or you can understand how it would get to like Chinese whisper.
They're like
basically.
honest mistakes in a sense, but
as opposed to Voyager or a crew of genocidal mercenaries.
Yes, exactly.
which is a bigger mistake.
Which would be a bigger mistake, definitely. But I was just thinking, what would this monk have made if he'd suddenly be transported forward in time and saw this bizarre recreation of him, literally, hanging on a piece of glass in the middle of the room, projecting out of nowhere. It's magic, basically.
Well, I mean, and now you get to the stage with like CGI Peter Cushing, where it's not too difficult to imagine that monk having a face taken from a death mask, for example, and basically being not an actor playing him, but a CGI representation of him, which is just
or a hologram.
It's kind of interesting. You mentioned something there I want to come back to, which is this idea. You point out that in Living Witness, the 700 years in the future, these alien societies don't seem to have changed much technologically from where they were when Voyager encountered them. This is one of the things that I find interesting about Voyager's perception of the future. It presents it as static. Like Voyager doesn't seem to imagine that anything will ever happen that will change the future. The future will be what it is now, just extrapolated into infinity. And you see that even, you could argue that you see it in the basic premise of Voyager, which is Voyager is thrown across the universe and two crews have to come together, Starfleet and the Maquis. And it's like, how are we going to do that? And it's like, we're going to do what we do on every other Star Trek ship. You're going to wear Starfleet uniforms. We're going to have a clear hierarchy of command. We're going to have a first officer, a security chief, and a helmsman. You're going to fit those roles and you're going to fit into them perfectly. And you have this idea, nothing will ever change. And you sort of see that as it goes over Voyager. Like the biggest change, I would argue, in terms of like Voyager, like as the ship goes along, the ship doesn't like adopt weird technology. It doesn't start incorporating Vidian technology into sick bay, or it doesn't start like copying Hirogen sort of weapons or stuff like that. Like when the ship gets Borg modifications in Scorpion, first thing they do in The Gift is basically dislodge that and sort of restore the pristine finish. And like even we talked earlier about like Starfleet, when you look at stuff like the Relativity, the sets look very similar to what they do on any other Starfleet ship, for example. There's this idea, I think, and even like if you look at, say, episodes about the future of Voyager, where you look at episodes like, for example, Shattered, which like jumps across Voyager's history. It never imagines a time when Voyager, or even like before and after, where Kes is living backwards, with the exception of the disruption of the Year of Hell. Like, Voyager never seems capable of imagining a future that is different than the present. Like, it never seems to imagine, like, a time when Voyager will not be a Starfleet ship, when it won't have a rigid hierarchy of command, when it won't have people who are familiar staffing it. It basically imagines that, like, Voyager is trapped in amber, and it will remain so, like, until the end of time. Like, I think in Before and After, like, the biggest shock is that the Doctor has hair now.
Yeah.
Like, that's the biggest change over God knows how many years. Is that the Doctor has hair. And it's got this sort of weird, like you talked about like this fear, like you see in Doctor Who, where you go to the end of history and it's like all ruins and nobody's around to remember or anything like that. Voyager, I think, has the opposite anxiety, where Voyager imagines that nothing will ever be too different. I mean, even when you go to, say, Endgame, which is the one where the episode skips ahead and it shows what happened when Voyager got home. And I mean, you have horror stories. You've got like sad instances. Chakotay's dead, I think, from what I recall. Tuvok has a degenerative illness, which conveniently happened to kick in after the show ended. So we don't actually have to show that. But by and large, everybody seems to be doing relatively fine. It's like, it's not as if nothing catastrophic has happened. The Federation has not had to deal with like the collapse of the Romulan Star Empire. There's like we haven't gone to war with the Klingons. There's no sense of like the situation having changed that much at all. Harry is finally a captain, despite the fact he spent 7 years as an ensign.
Even compared to All Good Things, I suppose, where you do have kind of geopolitical changes in that imagined future.
Even like Worf going over to like the Klingon becoming a governor, for example, or the crew drifting apart and Deanna being like dead and like Riker being sort of estranged from the family as a part of that, or Data being a professor and being a jerk. Like Data being a jerk is a more fundamental character change than anything that happens to the Voyager staff.
It's true. Yeah, definitely. Well, I wonder whether also, I mean, another way of looking at it is when it was announced that Discovery was going to be a prequel. I mean, we talked about how we've had just endless Star Trek prequels in a sense ever since Voyager. And a lot of people have sort of said, well, they just couldn't go further forward, because, I mean, I'm one of the fans who've always said, I'd like to see what happens next. I'd like to see what does the sort of collapse of the Romulan Empire look like? What does what's the kind of fallout of that geopolitical history? I think it'd be fascinating.
But I rewatched Deep Space Nine, and like it's very clear that they're ending Deep Space Nine with the end of the Dominion War. War.
Yeah.
But like in the penultimate episode, before they go into the final 10 episode arc, like that's dedicated, it's Inter Arma Silent Legions, which is the one where Bashir goes to Romulus. But the entire premise of that episode is that like the war is going to end soon and things are not going to go back to the way they are. Like Sloane has this big speech where it's like, if you think about like what's happened logically, there are going to be consequences and changes. Like the Klingon Empire is not going to be in a position to wage war for another decade. The Cardassians are going to be turned into an annexed sort of territory, much like, say, Germany will be sort of occupied by the Allied forces after the war. So that's going to leave us and the Romulans, and that means that we're going to be in a different situation than we've ever been before, and we need to actually start preparing for that. And it's like, Deep Space Nine understands fundamentally that, you know, it's change over a course of history, like over a course of time. 7 years, everything changes completely. But if you look at Voyager, Voyager is very much the exact opposite point of view, to the point where it's impossible to imagine anything ever changing. Like, you get an offhand line of dialogue in Think Tank, I think, where it's discovered that the Think Tank has cured the Vidian phage. But that never happened while the Vidians were around. You never got to see that, you know? Yeah. You can never imagine the Kazon stopping fighting amongst themselves. The Herosian, given the Herosian sort of like holographic technology was supposed to fundamentally reinvent their society, but when they show up in the 7th season in Flesh and Blood again, they're still hunters. Yeah. They're still hunting wildly, and they haven't changed in any tangible way, shape, or form. Or even like you take the Malon, for example, in the 5th season, where like in the first episode, Voyager like destroys their primary dumping ground. But for some reason, despite the fact Voyager travels like 20,000 light years over the course of the 5th season with the jump in Timeless, and then there's a jump again later in the season, I can't remember exactly which one it is, but there's several jumps in the 5th season in terms of travel. But like at the end of the year, 20,000 light years further on their journey, they're still bumping into the Malon. And the Malon, despite having like presumably lost their primary dumping ground, are still doing exactly the same thing that they were before. It's really weird for a show that is fundamentally about moving forward. Like it's a like you have with Voyager, you have like a dot on the map, which is where you start, a dot on the map, which is where you end, and you have a linear line between the two of them. There's no sense of movement. There's never any real sense. And like, you have Kes gone, and you've 709 coming on board, but by and large, you could watch the final 3 seasons, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th season in any order, and it would make no difference to you. You could watch the first 3 pretty much in any order, and it wouldn't make any difference to you. I think the 4th season is the only one where you have an actual arc, and that's because, you know, 709 starts as a Borg and ends as a member of the crew.
And even when there's a jump, it doesn't really register in any meaningful way. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I don't know, it's sort of like ticking something off a list somehow. Okay, we're 10,000 light years closer to home, but it doesn't feel any different. It's still the Delta Quadrant. It's exactly, because the Delta Quadrant just seems to be some sort of amorphous thing somehow that, you know, whatever happens, we're in the Delta Quadrant. It's all a bit
when we are like, you know, 15,000 light years from home.
Yeah.
And these are guys who the first episode established as like scavengers with like really poor technology. How the hell do like people within Neelix's living memory get like 35,000 or 50,000 light years closer to Earth than we are? It's like Voyager's attitude is, Voyager's pretty much been running in place, you know?
Yeah. I wonder though whether this idea about, you know, this inability to move forward, to move into the future, to sort of envision this post-Voyager Star Trek series that many of us would like to see. You know, you get this idea again and again. People say, it's all been done. You know, that you can't go any further. The future in the 24th century is sort of perfected. You can't go any further than that. I sort of wonder whether it's, you know, obviously when you started Next Gen, so you went from the original series to Next Gen, you had Gene Roddenberry around really spearheading it, and he was able to sort of reinvent his own franchise somehow. I wonder if it's sort of, there's some kind of anxiety, however much Star Trek has changed and however much people have been willing to move the goalposts a bit, to kind of reorder things, there's some kind of anxiety about imagining what the next step would be and not having Roddenberry around to kind of tell us, well, 100 years later they're going to be doing this. I mean, is it that the 24th century is just so perfect? And, you know, you do see that with Next Gen, there's this idea of these kind of perfected people. But
I've never subscribed to that idea, because I think if you look at the Star Trek show with the most imperfect characters, with the possible exception of Discovery, given its characterization of Lorca and Burnham and stuff like that. But the show with the most imperfect, most human or most relatable characters was Deep Space Nine, which was the show before Voyager started, like the journey home, and before you got all the nostalgia and stuff like that. And I think maybe it's not a problem specific to Voyager. I think it's a broader cultural issue where we have difficulty imagining things that extend beyond. And I think that this is a discussion that we had around, say, the release of Tomorrowland and around like Christopher Nolan's Jones' Inception in 2014, which is like, I think as a society we have difficulty imagining an optimistic or hopeful future, and like so we have difficulty imagining a world that will exist in 20 or 30 years time with like the threat of nuclear war, environmental like collapse and stuff like that, which is ironic because you'd imagine that would be what you would, when you would need it most. And in the 60s, even when you had the threat of nuclear war, you could imagine a future where we were reaching for the stars. Like, it was like a logical extrapolation from like the Apollo program. But now we can't seem to imagine hopeful futures. We imagine dystopias. We imagine like Mad Max, Book of Eli, The Road. We imagine stuff like even Logan or Rise of the Planet of the Apes. We imagine like society falling. And it seems like the only way that we can imagine an optimistic future is like retrofuturism, is to like remember when the future was better. To quote Dan Quayle, the future was better yesterday. And I feel like maybe that's an issue with Star Trek, is that like we can't bring ourselves to imagine extrapolating from now into the future in the same way that like you could argue the original Star Trek was an extrapolation of 60s values. I think you could argue that the Next Generation was an extrapolation of like Reagan era values. And even Deep Space Nine was in some ways like an extrapolation of sort of like Clinton era anxieties. And even like Voyager, when it sort of started to U-bend around back in itself, was a very Clintonian sort of Star Trek. But I can't imagine now how difficult it must be to try and conceive of like a Star Trek for now without having a basis and going back and imagining what the future used to be like sort of fetishizing, you know, the sort of the Apple Store design of the original series, where you could get back and you could like, you have a template for what it looks like. It's like you don't have to imagine an optimistic future because you have an example that you can just emulate and a memory you can evoke.
And it's nostalgic for us. I mean, there is that kind of weird thing, you know, if you think about Captain Proton in Voyager, I think there's a definite kind of link. I mean, I know it goes back further historically, but there's a definite link between the cheesiness of Captain Proton and the cheesiness of the original series. You know, and you have this kind of action oriented, you have this kind of, you know, you have the girl in the skimpy outfit, you have kind of all these
which is
elements,
like your Alice Eve in Star Trek Into Darkness.
Well, that's another way of looking at it. Definitely. But I mean, I think it's interesting for Voyager, the nostalgia seems uncomplicated. Nostalgia seems quite cozy. It's quite comfortable. You know, it's Tom Paris with his cars and his TV. It's all quite nice. It's all quite mild. I think it's interesting in Deep Space Nine, you get the episode Bada Bing, Bada Bang, where Sisko makes this quite interesting point about that kind of nostalgia, where he basically says this is inaccurate. You know, the past was a bad place.
For people who weren't white.
Exactly, for people who weren't white, you know, and this is a fantasy. And there is that sort of element with nostalgia of, is it in a sense real, or is it kind of an imagined thing? But there's also,
we pretend it was. Well, I mean, you could argue that exists with Star Trek itself. Like I love Star Trek. This is, when I make this point, I always have to say beforehand, I absolutely love Star Trek. It's one of my favorite things in the world. So whatever I say next, I say out of love, as much as anything else. So you know you're getting
that's quite a build-up.
Yeah, you know you're getting something juicy when I begin with that provocation.
Yeah.
But like, we tend to remember Star Trek not necessarily exactly how it was, and more how we want it to be. Like, so we remember Star Trek as this liberal utopian ideal, and like in the original Star Trek, we think of like Kirk kissing Uhura, and like there's a lot of was that the first interracial kiss on American TV? Well, first of all, it wasn't, because you had I Spy beforehand. But second of all, we divorced that from its context. Like, Plato's Stepchildren has Kirk and Uhura kissing as a grotesque sideshow for a bunch of all-powerful aliens. It's not a kiss; it's a sexual assault. But we pretend that it was this big enlightened moment where it was like white man, black woman kissing, and this is like Star Trek liberal idealism sort of pushing forward. And you get a lot of that, and you tend to forget that, like, for all the great episodes, like, for example, Errand of Mercy, where you had this sort of scathing criticism of the Vietnam War, or you had stuff like, for example, Devil in the Dark, which was this beautiful sort of exploration, like racism and otherism and stuff like that. You also had this sort of reflexive quality in other episodes, where you had stuff like a reactionary quality. You had stuff like A Private Little War, which was based, or was it Friday's Child, which was basically Vietnam is good. We should be doing more Vietnam. We should be investing full time in Vietnam and this sort of stuff. And you have like the horrible sort of racialization, the Klingons, where they're basically like bronze face, they're sort of yellow face, like Fu Manchu menaces. Like, we tend to forget and we tend to gloss over that because we like to imagine Star Trek being like idealistic and liberal. I mean, even when you talk about Voyager is perhaps the most like right wing and reactionary Star Trek show, in that you have episodes like the Kazon. Like, the Kazon are pretty racist. Coming out in the context of like Los Angeles riots and stuff like that. They're very much like a racialized other. They're freed slaves who turned into barbarians, which is deeply racist, just to be absolutely clear. Yeah. You have, for example, episodes like Displaced, which is, how Trump views immigration, which is about a bunch of aliens who mysteriously start showing up on Voyager and seem friendly and polite. And isn't it great that we meet new friends on this journey? But no, they're secretly coming to take over Voyager and replace its crew. You have episodes like, for example, Day of Honor, which is a seemingly innocuous romance with Torres and Tom, where Voyager meets a bunch of refugees. And isn't it sad that they've been dispossessed and they've been harmed by the Borg? And shouldn't we try and help these people? No, they're mercenaries. They're going to hold our warp core ransom and try to use any means necessary to force us to bend to their will. Like Voyager, Star Trek has always
definitely compared to, say, when Deep Space Nine did a refugee story, where it was much more complex somehow.
Yeah.
Exactly, sympathetic, but also recognising the
problems that you have,
the difficulties around that.
Yeah.
But yes, exactly, they didn't turn out to be villains at the end of it all.
Which is Voyager has this sort of mean streak running through it. And I mean, like, I love Star Trek. I think Star Trek's fantastic. But when we talk about Star Trek's liberalism, and when we tend to be surprised at like certain reactionary aspects of, say, the fan base who react with like horror to things like Discovery, there is a basis for that in the franchise's history that we tend to gloss over because we have a nostalgia for Star Trek itself. We have and that's what I think when you mentioned Voyager's unproblematic nostalgia, which is like through the embodiment of Tom Paris. Like he has like the first season he has like this old style pub, which is from France, from when his academy days, but might as well have come from the 18th century.
Yeah.
You have his Venus sort of fantasy in like Life Signs. You have in the third season you have this sort of Club Med resort. You have in the fourth season you start getting stuff like his the workshop, the auto workshop where he does his stuff. You have Spirit Folk. You have this sort of nostalgic Irish village. We won't go into that.
That could be a whole episode in itself, I think.
But you have in the seventh season you have like this 3D sort of theatre which evokes sort of 50s science fiction. And even on Enterprise they carry that over and they do like movie night of these old science fiction monster movies.
Which is interesting because I was going to say, is Tom Paris a kind of Brannon Braga character in a sense? Yes. Because I think, and what's interesting about Tom Paris is, in some ways, you say nothing changes on Voyager. He is a character who does change because all his rough edges get smoothed off and he becomes kind of rehabilitated, but he becomes rehabilitated partly through these kind of nostalgic things. So, and it's strange, isn't it? Because we start off with Tom Paris is a kind of chauvinist. He's a bit of an unpleasant guy. His relationship towards women is pretty shady.
Worth noting his middle name is Eugene, by the way.
Well, that's an interesting point, definitely. It's definitely a very backward kind of attitude by 24th century, Starfleet standards. And at the same time, all his nostalgia is also, he's also a bit of a dinosaur. He's a kind of cultural dinosaur because he's obsessed with the past. He's obsessed with this.
He's the guy they call
kind
in
of rosy version of.
To examine the truck in, what was it, the 30s?
Exactly.
This is our expert.
Exactly, yeah. And I don't know, and it is very different from, say, in the original series you had Marla MacGyver, the historian. Well, I mean, that was not a great example, but at least notionally she was on the ship as a historian, like she was a professional historian. Tom Paris is the sort of amateur enthusiast. And I think it also raises this interesting question of he's nostalgic for things he's never experienced. And that is perfectly possible. I mean, people feel nostalgic for the 1930s. They haven't lived through the 1930s. There's sort of elements of the kind of glamour, elements of versions of the past, or like the 1950s. And that idea that Sisko says about it wasn't all like that. Or I'm thinking of, there was that film, what was the film with Julianne Moore and her husband turned out to be gay? And it was very much that kind of...
A Single Man?
No, it was before that.
Who was the husband of it?
Dennis Quaid, I think.
Oh, okay.
It's going back a while. But it was very much peeling back the kind of image of like the perfect suburban 1950s, a bit like Mad Men did later on, I suppose. The kind of...
even like Pleasantville, for example.
Exactly. Pleasantville, same thing again. Yeah. Sort of recognising that beneath that there might be darker or more sort of gnarly or more complex emotional landscapes beneath that kind of veneer of perfectly presented nostalgic idea about, the past was better, the past. I mean, it's, make America great again. We've got it now, haven't we? It's exactly, you're right. This is the year of kind of trying to return to this past.
That never existed.
It never existed. And that's the interesting thing is, as they say, you can never go home again. There is that idea that nostalgia is on some level a longing for something impossible. Yeah, but Voyager makes it possible. That's the interesting thing about Voyager as a project, is it kind of, Voyager says you can go home again. In the first episode we have, set a course for home. At the end of the last episode we get the same thing, set a course for home. So weirdly, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. You're right, they never get there. They never quite get there. But it's an ideal which appears to be possible. It's meaningful. It represents something to them, doesn't it? And, they can kind of, maybe not to 7 of 9 who sort of questions it, but to the vast majority of the crew, they can engage with it. And I think as an audience, you can engage with it. You do feel, certainly in those early seasons, that kind of longing for them to get back, and that sense of kind of being separated from their home and being homesick and so on. So it's kind of an interesting area. They're sort of dancing around all these kind of issues of the past and the future, and where do we find this place in it? But then they have this one thing that they kind of pinned everything on that symbolises everything that they want somehow. And maybe they never quite answer the question, because they refuse to show us what happens next, of was it all it was cracked up to be? Was it possible to go home again? Did life pick up where they left it? Or realistically, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, so actually, I just want to go back to you talking about like Tom Paris as a Brannon Braga insert, because there is a certain element of that. Because like one of the things Braga did when he took over Voyager was he pushed it more towards like, and you can see it even in like the 7th season of The Next Generation, where you have episodes like Genesis, for example, or Sub Rosa, where like Braga, or even like the 6th season with Schisms, Braga has this huge interest in weird sort of 50s B movies. Yeah, that is a nostalgia unto itself. That like Braga in some ways seems to imagine like Star Trek as a vehicle to tell the stories that like Tom Paris would watch in his 3D theater. So you have like Darkling in the 3rd season, where you have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with EMH. You have like Macrocosm, which is these 50s B movie computer generated viruses. You have Scorpion, which has like these computer generated monstrosities in there. You have like this thing that happens throughout where you have this very B movie quality to what happens on Voyager, that I think in some ways is also nostalgic of itself. And in some ways, like you can see that in some ways Voyager seems to be programmed by Tom Paris, where it's like, okay, well now we're going to meet the Vidians and they're going to be plague monsters, but they're going to have like, it's going to be like Nazi death camps. They're going to operate Nazi death camps because like that's what we expect from a 50s B movie. You're going to have like monsters that are like the 90s equivalent of like puppets, which are CGI animated like giant stabbing viruses, for example. You're going to have stuff like weird mutations. You're going to have like all this sort of icky stuff. You're going to have the mail on like, was it Juggernaut, where it's basically Phantom of the Opera on like a runaway train. Yeah. You have this sort of like, even within the stories that Voyager tells, even when they're not about nostalgia, they frequently feel nostalgic. You can sort of see Tom Paris in some ways as an insert character in that sense.
Rewriting the story. Almost like in sort of worst case scenario, rewriting the narrative as it goes along. And definitely, I mean, Voyager is a show that definitely has a kind of major course correction at a certain point. And whether however you feel about it, I mean, I feel nostalgic for those early years of Voyager, partly because I remember watching Caretaker in my biology teacher's science lab after school, because he'd recorded it and put it on for all of us. I sort of remember being a young fan and the excitement that surrounded that show, more so than Deep Space Nine, although Deep Space Nine is... it's probably my favourite Star Trek series. Yeah. Exactly. Voyager was the one, there was a lot of excitement about it. It felt like it was doing something new to begin with.
It has the best premise of any Star Trek show, which is like, you're going to cast two crews that will never work together. A bunch of terrorists, a bunch of Starfleet officers who thought they were on like a 1-month cruise. You're going to throw them together on the other side of the galaxy without any friends, without any support, and they're going to have to find their way home. Like, that's the premise pretty much of Battlestar Galactica, the reboot. Yeah. And Ronald, in some ways, a part of me wonders how much of like Battlestar Galactica was Ronald Moore basically giving the middle finger to Brannon Braga on Voyager, being the sort of however their creative relationship sort of was at that point. Yeah. But you have this sort of sense of Voyager has the best idea of the best core premise of any Star Trek show, and it just squanders it. And part of me wonders if some of the nostalgia in Voyager becomes nostalgia for the lost premise. Because you can see at certain points in the run, one of the issues with Voyager was Berman wanted a very conservative, very safe, and like Brian Fuller's the guy who's talked about this. Like Berman wanted a very safe, very conservative Star Trek, because apparently he couldn't get it on Deep Space Nine, because Moore and Bear were like more assertive on Deep Space Nine about what they wanted to do, to the point where they would famously lie to Berman. Really? Yeah, Berman would say basically, I want this, you can do the Dominion War. And it's okay, well, 1 or 2 episodes. Like, okay, maybe six episodes? Like, okay. And it lasts 2 years, that sort of stuff. Yeah. And you have basically on Voyager...
Well, also Voyager is launching their network, isn't it? So it's a big corporate... I mean, Voyager, I think, has all this kind of corporate responsibility that Deep Space Nine didn't have, that even Next Gen didn't have because of the way it was syndicated, right? So they had... With Next Gen, they had a kind of freedom, in a sense. Yeah. And Voyager is maybe the first series that is straitjacketed by that. And one way of looking at it, I suppose, is there is always this kind of element of, and we've heard the stories about Enterprise and the interference coming from the suits and saying they wanted, a boy band in there. Exactly.
My favorite Enterprise interference story is around the 2nd season, which is when the suits began properly interfering. I think that was around the time the CBS got involved. Right, yeah. Braga and Berman, who had traditionally been left on their own to do their own thing, started being dragged into meetings with higher up in the networks to explain the plots of upcoming episodes. And Berman was not used to doing this. this, and Berman basically laid out this pitch for the episode Minefield. And Minefield is the episode where, it's actually one of the better episodes of the second season, where one of the lead characters ends up like with a mine pinning him to the hull of the ship. And he goes into great detail about the plotting of the episode and what's going to be about. And he goes on for about 15 minutes. And then at the end, there's this awkward silence as the network executives sort of look at one another and pause. And then one of them sort of, gently like raises his fingers and say, I have a question. It's like, Berman's like, okay, what's the question? What's a hull? That's the level of studio interference that you have, like meddling in a show without any.
They have no understanding of. I thought you were going to say something different. I thought you were going to say that it's the perfect emblem for the situation they're in. Literally like nailed to this ship and unable to, not having the freedom to move around. And I mean, I read an essay about Enterprise, which was sort of looking at those early 2 seasons and commenting on the number of episodes in which people end up being tied up, imprisoned, incarcerated. They're basically, their freedom is constrained one way or another, which is odd for a show which is about exploring the new frontier, and they're trying to get back to this idea of the kind of freedom of going out there for the first time. They're just constantly being kind of locked up, or
whether by the network or by their own history
as well. Kind of strangled, creatively strangled in a sense.
I think that brings it back to Brannon Braga's sort of continuity pornographers thing, where you got a sense with the early seasons of Enterprise that at times they felt sort of strangled by continuity and strangled by
everyone, basically. And I mean, the other thing, of course, that talking about Rick Berman, what Rick Berman would say about the the declining ratings and late Voyager, and in some ways something that beset Enterprise was this idea of franchise fatigue. And I think when we think of, I'm a bit sceptical about the idea of franchise fatigue. I sort of think there's maybe more creative fatigue. I think that's his way of blaming the fans for the fact that the quality of the product was declining to a large extent. But there is one way of looking at it, which is that maybe this idea that Voyager represents kind of the end, you talk about the end of history, it's the end of Star Trek history in a sense, is this idea that time is sort of running out, the future is running out, we're kind of running out of steam somehow for this journey. And that's why we have to keep going back and go back further and further, back into the past and get into these prequels, because somehow in the past there was this kind of energy and this kind of drive that somehow has sort of petered out by this point because of this kind of fatigue.
There's a great interview, and one of the things actually I would recommend picking up the Enterprise Blu-rays for is there are these wonderful interviews with Braga, and I'm actually more sympathetic to Braga than most fans would be. Mm-hmm. But he talks about he worked on the shows for the better part of 12 years, from the 4th season when he interned on The Next Generation through to basically the end of Enterprise. And he talks about there was a moment when he was working on Enterprise where he literally knew he had no more in him. Yeah. But he had to keep going. Yeah. And you're wondering, that's horrific. How did they get into this situation in the first place? How did they not move forward? How did they not pass the reins on, try and embrace new visions and new possibilities? At what point did they stop? And I think you point out the 4th season of Enterprise is probably, I prefer the 3rd season to be honest, but the 4th season of Enterprise at least has a bit more energy to it, in large part because they surrender a large part of the control to Manny Koto, who is at least a new vision. Now he's very fixated on Star Trek continuity, he's very fixated on Star Trek history and stuff like that, but he's a fresh set of eyes and he's got a lot more energy. And I think, to be honest, that's part of why Deep Space Nine works so well as well, because they surrendered control to Ira Steven Behr, who he'd worked on the 3rd season of The Next Generation, obviously, but he had, he'd only worked on 1 year of the show. He'd worked under Michael Piller, and he'd sort of grated at that, and he had his own vision of what he wanted to do. So Deep Space Nine, after the 2nd season, I think you pointed the Maquis Part 1 and 2 as the point where everyone went, okay, Voyager's important now, Behr, you steer this. This is your job now. And that's the point where Deep Space Nine suddenly starts going, in many ways, completely off the rails in terms of Star Trek terms, where it starts getting a lot more cynical, a lot more bleak, a lot more nihilistic, and a lot more questioning of what Star Trek is. But it's also the point at which it becomes more creatively energized. Yeah. I think Voyager never had that, because Voyager underwent a lot of creative change. In terms of Piller, left in the 1st season, then came back in the 2nd season. Then you had a mutiny. Then he left the end of the 2nd season. Taylor took over for the 3rd and 4th season. Then Braga took over, in theory from the 5th, but had been steering it from the 3rd. But you never had a proper changing of the guard creatively. Braga was there from the beginning. Braga wrote, I think, was it Parallax, the 2nd episode of the show?
Right. Yeah.
And he basically he was a huge influence from that point onwards. And by that point, he'd already been writing Star Trek for the better part of 4 years. He'd already written a feature film in Generations and would write another one in First Contact. You had this weird sense of Voyager's reluctance to let go of the past in terms of like embracing new creative voices, embracing new perspectives and trying new things. And I mean, Fuller's talked about like when he was on staff on Voyager, he would always push to new things and he would basically be treated as the brat on staff as a result of that.
Yeah.
And I mean, when Moore went over, he talked about how like writers like Michael Taylor and Fuller had basically taken lots of crap from the higher up because they wanted to do new things. They wanted to push in new directions. I mean, even if you look at stuff like the 5th season of Voyager, like, look at Michael Taylor's original pitches for episodes like Once Upon a Time. Michael Taylor's pitch for Once Upon a Time was you would tell the story entirely from the perspective of Naomi Wildman. Like, you would have no idea what was happening outside the holodeck. She would be basically, Voyager was going through a year of hell situation, and the crew would basically put her as the only child on the ship in a holodeck to teach her that everything was okay and to, like, convince her that everything was fine. You would occasionally see glimpses of the outside world coming in with people like scars and like damage and like, you know, the malfunction in the holodeck or stuff like that would indicate that something was wrong. But this was too adventurous for the show. So you get what is a very watered down, very generic, very middle of the road story. And again with the fight, which is the infamous episode where Chakotay suddenly has an interest in boxing. Because somebody asked Robert Beltran what he would like to do this year and he said boxing. But the original pitch for that was going to be much more abstract and random and sort of like, again, this is the guy who wrote The Visitor for Deep Space Nine. So he pitched an episode that would have connected back to like, you know, the middle of the 20th century, the 50s again, but that was shut down. It's like, just make it a subspace alien. And you have a lot of that in Voyager where there's a reluctance to try something new, and you instead fall back on
this kind of conservatism, isn't it? It's kind of, and you know, to be fair to Brannon Braga, I mean, I think sometimes he was trying to push for, he said, you know, he wanted Year of Hell to be like
a year.
Exactly, you know, I mean, that is a bold, and with Enterprise, actually, he was the one who wanted the first year to be on Earth. You know, he was actually trying to come up with new ideas, but I mean, he was obviously being squashed creatively by this kind of conservative machine that was sort of saying, no, we want more of the same, we want this kind of reliable whatever. And I'd say it's interesting. I mean, one very strong season of Voyager, I think, though, is the 4th season. You do get with 7 of 9, you get that very strong arc. And I mean, I feel 7 of 9 is sort of overexposed on Voyager, but there are, you know, that's a good story there, and it's told really well, and they do a lot with that. But I wonder if there's also significance, you know, for someone like Brannon Braga. 7 of 9 is kind of his ideal character to write about, isn't she? Because she is this kind of 1960s fantasy pin-up girl. Do you know what I mean? And there's
also I don't know how you know, potentially libelous we want to get here, but there is like the famous interview that Braga gave when he was working on The Next Generation, where he was all like, "Oh, I'm totally into dominatrix sex and all this sort of stuff.
Wow,
and I'm all into the implements and the harnesses and stuff like that." And you could sort of see that in 7 of 9, who is this icy blonde, Hitchcock blonde, like,
and who he ends up dating. So, you know.
In real life, I don't want to draw too much of an association or parallel there. But you have that sort of connection there already. And I think, like, you're right when you say the 4th season. The 4th season even has an arc that extends beyond 7 and 9. Like, you have the Hirogen arc, which is one of the few points in the series where there is forward momentum from episode to episode. So, for example, they establish contact with Earth in Hunters. And, you know, sort of... first of all, the EMH goes over and message in a bottle. That leads into Hunters, where they start getting letters from home. The network is sabotaged, but that leads to Prey, which is where you deal with the consequences of Scorpion, and you have this wonderful story for 7. And even in the middle of that arc where you have, not Revulsion, Repression, which is the one where 7 of 9, it's a horrifically dated, and again, you want to talk about Voyager's conservatism. It's like, it's a date rape accusation episode. It's a false rape accusation episode, basically, which is really uncomfortable to watch now. But even in the context of that episode, you deal with continuity where you have 7 of 9 having been disciplined for what she did in Prey, and you have Voyager going, well, hey, look, the Hirogen are coming, we probably need to upgrade our weapons. And then you have the Killing Game Part 1 and 2, where they're like, okay, well, you know, now you've got this big Hirogen story, but at the end we make peace and we go off in our separate ways. And then the Hirogen are gone until the middle of the 7th season. Like, you have this clear movement in the 4th season, which you don't have in other seasons. And I mean, even stuff like the Hope and Fear, the finale, which pays off like plot threads that began with like Message in a Bottle and like Hunters, where you have this sort of like, ooh, there's a hidden Starfleet communication. What could they possibly be hinting at? And like, I think that even in the 5th season where Braga takes over, at the start of it, you start to see some of his interest creep in. You start to see stuff like Janeway becoming more ambiguous. Like, so for example, Night. Night is an episode where Janeway locks herself in her quarters to think about the past. Like, she goes back to thinking about, and like, Braga engages very much with like the legacy of Caretaker in the 5th season. Like, that's the season that gave us the ship the relativity.
Yeah.
You have this relativity going back as well. And you have this sort of this theme running through it. You have like the connection with you have Extreme Risk, where B'Elanna discovers that the Maquis have been dead and she sort of processes that. You have this like, in the 5th season, you do have an attempt to play with continuity. You have like Latent Image, which introduces more ambiguity in terms of who Janeway is, when it's revealed that she meddled with the Doctor's like personal continuity and his personal history and sort of reset him. Where you have this sort of this more personal version of a story that you had in Living Witness about the manipulation of history, where it's not just the manipulation of cultural history, it's the manipulation of personal history and what that means in terms of identity. But then that sort of peters out, and you have basically then 3 years of generic Star Trek stories. You could watch almost any episode of the 5th season, 6th season, 7th season of Voyager in any order, and you wouldn't really tell them apart outside of maybe quality, because I think the 7th season is not as good.
I mean, it's interesting just thinking, I know this is not meant to be a podcast about Brannon Braga, but thinking about Brannon Braga and his kind of creative constraints. I have a lot of sympathy for Brannon Braga. I mean, I think he was probably a bit of a jerk back in the day. I think he seems to have improved a lot with time.
There are famous stories about pitching. Yeah, you've heard the stories about people pitching.
Uncomfortable stories involving Brannon Braga, definitely. But I mean, you know, he was a young guy. He got this kind of dream job. I think you can kind of
underqualified. He had no, like, he was what, 30 something, and it's like, here, have this franchise that is older than you, and you are in charge of running that day to day. By the way, you can't do any of the stuff you want to do.
And I was just going to say, I mean, I think with Enterprise again, you know, 3rd season Enterprise, that was a really bold attempt to do something different. You know, although despite being fatigued, despite being exhausted, despite being constrained, he was trying to do something different. But it's kind of sad. Then you get the 4th season, he sort of takes a back seat. And then if you want to talk about nostalgia and the kind of the worst kind of nostalgia, that final episode, These Are the Voyagers, is like nostalgia gone mouldy, basically. I mean, because it's attempting to sort of manufacture nostalgia that doesn't land somehow. It doesn't work. It doesn't seem to understand the things that it thinks that people are going to love about it. You know, they described it as this Valentine's, the fans chucked it in the bin, basically, because it was awful. And it disrespected the actual fans that they'd managed to gradually cultivate over those last couple of years.
You want to talk about like nostalgia and history in terms of like the end of Enterprise. Like that's, again, when you talk about the end of history, like it's you're right when you say it's nostalgia gone mouldy. Because like Voyager always imagined the future would be relatively the same. The future would stay the same into God knows how long. And I think that was both a reflection of where the franchise was when Voyager launched, which was top of the world, 30th anniversary, that sort of stuff. And even like the 90s stuff where it's the end of history, liberal democracies triumphed and stuff. And then basically you have Enterprise where like, oh my God, the ratings are in decline, we're going to be cancelled, it's horrible. And in the real world you also have stuff like, oh my God, the war on terror is happening. Like everything that we thought was safe and stable in the 90s is no longer so. And then you have These Are the Voyagers, which is really, really, and you're right, like moldy is the perfect adjective for it, because it imagines, like it's built around the premise that, well, it's always the 7th season of the Next Generation.
Exactly.
It's like, we never got past
Jonathan Frakes has never put on any weight. Or
like bags under his eyes.
I mean, it's as if they kind of, it's as if when they were making the original Star Trek movies, they just put them back in the old uniforms and pretended that only a year
on
had
the old
passed,
sets,
and refused to kind of acknowledge the passage of time. And it's really creaky and cringy for that reason, because it feels desperate somehow. And I mean, it's interesting. I haven't seen it, so I don't want to make too many comments about it, but you know, what's the show that Brannon Braga is working on now? He's working on The Orville, which is basically imagining that Star Trek never changed. I mean, we've got Star Trek Discovery, which, you know, to some degree is polarizing because it does things differently and there are things that kind of new in there that people don't like. And then there's this other show which seems like this kind of built-in kind of conservative vision of, you know, those kind of TNG 90s Star Trek shows that you loved, that
pastels,
exactly. Like we can still do that. We can do that. You know, and some people love it for that. And I think that the appeal of that show is very much that nostalgia. And surely that's why they've you know, brought someone in from that era who, Brannon Braga isn't being offered the chance to do new Star Trek now because they want to do something new. They want to do something different. Exactly. So they'll get him back to do the kind of old Star Trek that he used to do.
I mean, I occasionally wade into certain dark corners of internet fandom, and there's this really weird movement of Star Trek fandom that is like overly nostalgic, and it's like the Orville is the true continuation of Star Trek. Like, no, the Orville, like, it's okay to like the Orville. That's grand. That's your business. People like what they like. And I mean, you know, maybe it has its own merits. I watched 3 episodes and that was enough for me, to be honest. But I mean, you like what you like, and you can make a defense of it on its own merits. And like, it's clearly trying, and it's clearly a love letter, and it's clear that like Seth MacFarlane, for all the hate that he gives, not that he gives, but that he receives, is trying to do something that means something to him, is meaningful, and like has value. And if you enjoy that, that's great. But Like, to claim that the Orville is the future of Star Trek is to fundamentally misunderstand it. It's not the future of Star Trek, it's the past. It's not even the past of Star Trek, it's the idea of the past of Star Trek. It's Tom Paris's holoprogram, except it's being aired in 2017. Like, it's that sort of mentality, and that's grand if that's what you want. And I would argue, like, my biggest problem with Discovery is that it is too nostalgic. It's too winking, and it's too nodding its own history. I would argue that it needs to be more, like, it needs to double down on the elements that people think are provocative about it, and just sort of run with it. Because we have this element that runs through popular culture at the moment. And I think you saw it with, like, the reaction to The Last Jedi. I know this is not a Star Wars podcast. You had this weird sense...
I haven't seen it yet, so don't spoil it.
I won't spoil it. Okay, I won't spoil it. Sorry. How have you not seen... Everybody's seen it
busy.
twice.
I know.
Like, you look at the box office figures and you have to figure that, like,
well,
it's a safe bet.
I will see it. It'll be around for a while.
It will, yeah, I don't think it's
I do always see Star Wars films, but I'm not, it's not my thing, so I'll get around to it.
You are hosting a Star Trek podcast, I think it's safe to say. But, like, a large part of the reaction to it, and I mean, it has its own problems we won't go into, I don't want to turn this into a Star Wars podcast, but part of the large reaction to it has been, like, its treatment of characters from the original Star Trek, Star Wars. And what it does is it treats them as characters with their own agency rather than treating them as, like, nostalgic fetish objects.
Yeah.
And that's a large part of what I think the Orville and Discovery, like, the conflict is between the two. I mean, like, you go on the Star Trek Discovery Reddit and, like, there's rules where you can't mention the Orville because every mention of the Orville is a passive-aggressive, well, I'm enjoying the Orville has the subtext of, unlike whatever they're calling Star Trek these days.
Yeah.
And you have this sort of battle within fandom where, do you want nostalgia? Do you want basically to be reserved the stuff that you liked as a child and to be sort of the stuff that you liked growing up? Or do you want something that's not as comfortable, not as comforting, but is new and different and odd? And I remember back in the day, like, you watch, and you could argue that this is the difference between Voyager and Deep Space Nine, and that Deep Space Nine was the show giving you what you didn't want. Like, people were like, it's a show based on a space station. It's got long-term arcs. Star Trek with a war in it? That's not Star Trek at all. Like, you look at Deep Space Nine, and Deep Space Nine's entire history consists of, that's not Star Trek. And the fan discourse at the time, and even now in certain quarters, is, that's not Star Trek. But you look at Voyager. Voyager is really the first, and I would argue only, Star Trek show that aired where there was a consensus that this is Star Trek, in that it didn't push the envelope. It didn't, it didn't challenge the preconception of what Star Trek could be. I think that in many ways that's the challenge that you're getting at the moment with, say, Discovery and with the Orville, is that you're basically stuck between these two extremes again. And if you look at history, I think that there's a right side of history, and I think that Voyager's, this is the Star Trek you know and love. This is trying to get back to sort of the 60s mood of Star Trek. This is, like, everybody's going to be wearing Star Trek uniforms. They're going to be following, it's going to exist within the Roddenberry box. It's not going to challenge any of your preconceptions. And Deep Space Nine's like, whoa, rock star Star Trek. History has, I think, come down on one side of that argument, and it's not the side that's Voyager, to be honest. And I like Voyager. I like Voyager a lot. I feel like I've been very mean to it over over this hour or whatever, but I like Voyager, but I think it's on the wrong side.
Voyager has a lot of, it has a lot of charm. It has, it has, and it's comforting, and that, I suppose, is what is, it's what Tom Paris, that's why he said it's written by Tom Paris, because Tom Paris's nostalgia is comforting, and it is a kind of softer, it does represent a softening of his character, which is not necessarily entirely a bad thing. And I mean, there is a place for nostalgia, and there is a place for that kind of comfort, and Star Trek is comfort food to some extent to a lot of people. You come home, you feel crap, you put on a Star Trek episode and it cheers you up. And Voyager is very good for that. And I think, it does have that kind of quality. Exactly, yeah.
Like, it was, you come home from
school
daring, and it's on,
but it is. And to be fair, they do. I mean, Living Witness is an interesting episode. Yeah. There are some kind of interesting, like, sci-fi ideas in Voyager.
Oh yeah.
It's just that from the point of view of kind of character and the sort of the basic setup is quite conservative. They're not able to really make you gasp in the way that, say, Deep Space Nine,
or even like Next Generation. Because I mean, the Next Generation is perhaps the safest of Star Trek shows at the moment. Like, it's the one where everybody agrees that was pretty great. And even the Next Generation, when it aired, was provocative. And, like, you had fans saying, this is not Star Trek. What the hell's going on? Why aren't they bickering with one another? Why isn't the Doctor and the First Officer? Why is there racism there? That sort of stuff. But even, like, stuff like, why is the Captain, this British guy who like delivers monologues rather than punching or kicking, doing a double-fisted punch on a guy in a reptile suit. It's not as if like Deep Space Nine is the only time that like Star Trek's had this sort of change. Voyager is the exception in terms of Star Trek, I would argue, because Voyager's the only time where a Star Trek show premiered and felt like Star Trek, if that makes sense. Where there was a consensus going into it that this is Star Trek, which is weird. And like Next Generation like was not as provocative of Deep Space Nine, but we tend to forget in its early years how polarizing it was. How many fans were like, this is not the Star Trek I grew up with. Because it was new and interesting and it did exciting things, and it sort of, in many ways, it rejected its own history. I mean, there's a famous story of like Ira Stephen Bear when they're doing Sarek. Like, he had to fight to do Sarek in the first place. But like the 3 or 4 hour arguments over the word Spock. Whether he could use the word Spock during the mind meld sequence. And like, you have this idea that like, for Roddenberry, and like, I mean, maybe he took it too far. I think you shouldn't be having 3 or 4 hour arguments over whether you can use the word Spock. But I think one of the great things about the first couple of seasons of The Next Generation is that there was no connection, no sort of real tether to the original series. There was a lot of, well, look, we're doing our own thing within this world. And I feel like a lot of pop culture now doesn't have that. A lot of pop culture is more like Voyager, where it's like, well, you're going to see Jurassic Park. The theme is going to blare as you go through the gates. You're going to see, there's going to be a big heroic moment for the T-Rex, despite the fact that T-Rex is at this stage, 30 years old. You know, you have stuff like Independence Day Resurgence, where you're going to get all the greatest hits.
We're living in a kind of nostalgic, you know, if you look at, I mean, look at J.J. Abrams, you know, he's rebooting Star Trek, rebooting Star Wars, rebooting Spielberg. His entire career is, I'm not a huge fan of J.J. Abrams,
I like Abrams,
but he is like, nostalgia is his thing. That's but almost all he is, and he's good at it. I'm not saying he doesn't make good films, but like, to me there is sort of a lack of anything new somehow. If you think of like The Force Awakens, I mean, I quite enjoyed that one, but I mean, that is just nostalgia basically. That's all it is, and there is something, I mean, you know, going back to the idea of continuity pornography, there is something kind of, maybe not pornographic, but there's a kind of guilty pleasure element associated with that. You're not really being forced to think about new things. You're not really being forced to do very much. And I suppose this idea of, you know, when they say, oh, they can't do a series set post Voyager because we just can't imagine it. We can't imagine what it would be like. It's like, well, that's your bloody job. You know, you're writing a Star Trek series.
That's where
you're a creative writer. You know, make something up.
But that's where you were when the original series ended.
Exactly.
You couldn't imagine what would happen 80 years down the line. And then it's like, okay, we imagine a British guy who monologues a lot.
Deal with it. You don't have to get it perfect. You know, just
it's a Star Trek series.
Do something new.
2 years. You know, like as long as your first episode, you know, your third episode isn't as racist as Code of Honor, and as long as you don't do anything as awful as like Angel 1 in your first season. By the way, I love it when people are like, I'm starting The Next Generation, I'm going to watch it from the beginning, and you're like, you might want a little bit racist, and when you think it's past that, a little bit sexist. But I feel like you're right that there is that horrible sort of like inability. There's too much nostalgia in modern culture, and it's not just entertainment. Because I think you're right when you say "Make America Great Again," evoking like 50s Americana, or even like Brexit in the UK, where that's very consciously evoking like an idea of Britain as a world power that is, you know, goes back. Like, as an Irish person, it makes me slightly uncomfortable in terms of like, you know, the empire and this idea of like having this sort of global reach. That
as an English person, it makes me quite uncomfortable.
But you do have that in a lot of modern culture where it's not so much that like we can't imagine fictional futures. It's more like we can't imagine like a real world future, and as a result, we can't imagine a fictional future. So we can't imagine the US being it's a world power on its own terms anymore. We have to try and remember what it was like when it was a world power. And so you conjure up like this Norman Rockwell images of 50s Americana instead of going, well, look, instead what we'll do is we'll head towards the shining city on the hill. You know, we'll build towards that. Instead you say, well, we'll build backwards. We'll go backwards to when it was, you know, when we were a world power. And you have that with like the UK as well, I think, to an extent.
Whereas Star Trek should be about that. You know, that future. And Star Trek is very aspirational. So, you know, we do sort of want to get to that kind of society in some ways, don't we? But, you know, we're not going to get it by going backwards.
So it's fascinating. Like, I think we started out talking about Voyager and history. We talked about Star Trek and history in a very broad sense.
We have, which is nice.
It is. Well, this is the end of 2017, start of 2018, so it's probably the perfect time.
We're literally recording on New Year's Eve for the benefit of our listeners, because this will probably drop in about a week or so. So yeah, it's the perfect time really to think about the past and the future. And, funnily enough, the last episode that we dropped was our Christmas episode, where
With
Clara
Christmas
and I were
Carol.
talking about Christmas Carol. So, the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
One of
This
them
is
is
the kind of-
stronger in Star Trek and
Yeah.
popular culture at the moment, I think.
Definitely. But, maybe that will change. We'll have
Maybe.
to see.
We'll
We'll have
hope.
to see in the future.
Well, I mean, you heard about, was it Brian Fuller's original pitch for Discovery, which is going to be, it would take you from the start of Star Trek past beyond Nemesis.
Yeah.
And I'm actually, it's weird to be nostalgic for something that never happened. I'm nostalgic for that pitch from last
for the Brian
year.
Fuller Discovery. Yeah.
But instead, we seem to be literally stuck in the past.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens in 2018 and moving forward from there. But it's been great fun talking about Star Trek and history and Voyager in particular. Darren, before we go, do you want to tell our listeners where they can encounter you online, where they can find out more about your thoughts?
Oh, perfect. I mean, we talk a lot about 90s pop culture and 90s nostalgia and stuff like that. I actually wrote a book on the X-Files, which sort of delves into this sort of thing, and in particular, the X-Files' relationship with history, and also in terms of the X-Files' relationship with the 90s sort of mood that we were talking about, the end of history, or the idea that you're, a generation, our Great Depression is our own, we have no future, that sort of stuff. So that's Opening the X-Files. It's from McFarlane's Publishers. It's available online at Amazon or at Waterstones, or basically anywhere where you can get good or even not so good books. So please feel free to give it a look. It's currently on sale on Amazon for, I think, about $4, which is a good price, I'd argue. You can also find me online at Twitter at Darren_Mooney. I write at the Movie Blog with a 0 in the B there, but you can just find me by Googling me. I host a podcast, which is the 250, where we also deal with nostalgia a little bit, where we talk about the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time, and we seem to have discovered that the golden age of movies seem to be being 12 in 1994. Thank you very much, Duncan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on. Well, it's been fun talking about history in Star Trek Voyager, but that's not the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to some of the other things you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Earl Grey.
I actually hadn't watched the show, I'm embarrassed to say, but I sat down and I started watching and recording episodes, and I immediately had an idea for a script because I found Data to be the most interesting character.
To the journey!
So you could have, carbonated gog.
Carbonated gog? I'm trying to understand how this works. So the gok are presumably a little squishy or juicy on the inside. So you're saying that in order to give them the appearance of life, they replicate it with carbonation inside the gok.
Yes, to make them pop and fizz. Kind of like an Alka-Seltzer,
Like
pop, fizz, fizz.
candy gok.
Warp 5.
And I go into the job interview, and I'm just parroting back to him things he said in his interviews, but he didn't know that I was just doing that. I would say, the thing about Star Trek is that you could write it. It's a mystery one week, it's a Western the next week, and I'm literally word for word things he said in an interview. So that's how I always feel. And I joke with him now that that's how I got the job. But
The 602 Club.
When we're talking about the idea of context in history, I think this is the biggest issue that I see in this film, and with the Force Awakens too. And you put them together because they're going to make a trilogy. Is look, writing 101. If you don't know the past and the future of your characters, you absolutely 100% cannot write their present.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended already.